Welcome to that Triathlon show, Chris. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Sunny here in Seattle, Friday morning. Have a few cups of coffee in me, so I'm ready to go.
Excellent. Yeah, no, that's. I heard that you have a nice mountain bike ride coming up later on today. So it seems like it's going to be a great start to the weekend. Before we get into today's main topics, can you give us a bit of an introduction to yourself? Tell us more about who you are and what you do.
Yeah, so I'm a 47-year-old master's level endurance athlete. I come from a multi-sport background, but these days I work as a licensed physical therapist, consultant, coach, and do a lot of teaching where I travel around, share my perspective with other clinicians and coaches. Other than that, I'm married to an amazing woman, Mimi, and I have two incredible kids, Liv and Kai, who are 7 and 10 years old. So life is busy, but I've somehow managed to blend all of my interests and passions together. And being able to do a podcast with you is, stuff like that's the icing on the cake. So, as I mentioned from the outset, I want to thank you for having me on. You've had some great guests. So it's an honor to be here.
Yeah, and I'm very excited to speak to you. And I found out about you through some mutual connections and contacts. So and have since been reading up on some of your materials and what you put out there, and it's all really good. So I'm really excited to dig into it in a bit more detail. Why don't we start with injuries, which I think is probably, it's one of the most popular topics, not popular perhaps, most topics that people search for information about, because unfortunately they end up suffering from injuries, in particular with running, but there are other obvious injuries in triathlon as well. Where I want to start here is perhaps if you can give a summary of what would your best tips be for how to avoid injuries, and talking about overuse injuries, not so much traumatic injuries.
Yeah, that opens up Pandora's box. So, I see people and consult people. I was on a call with a fellow this morning, and no one reaches out to me until things run amok or go awry. And I think naturally people look to a lot of the training loads that they're dealing with, and rightfully so, because they're significant, especially if we're talking about triathlon, because you have three disciplines that all have unique performance demands, and you're trying to plug those into a busy existence. So, I think from an injury standpoint, when I audit an athlete, I really sort of zoom out, or as the saying goes, look at their situation from an aerial view. So yes, I want to know about their workloads, and I'm going to have them pull up training peaks. And I think a lot of clinicians don't do that. I want to get very granular, looking at how they approach a training week, how they're managing their training intensity distribution, how this is interfacing with their day-to-day commitments. But I think what a lot of people don't do is look at this athlete from an ecosystem standpoint. I was on a call yesterday with a fellow who is a gifted marathoner. And for example, he developed a bone stress injury. And he had alluded to something during the initial consultation that, it was suggestive of a negative life event. And, and he wasn't very forthcoming with it. And, I was talking to him yesterday, and I said, you had mentioned that you went through a challenging or stressful situation, and I don't want to pry, but can we go through that or revisit it if you're comfortable? And he said, yeah, he's a healthcare professional, and he was named in a lawsuit where a patient fell, and it wasn't his fault necessarily, but I think he was part of a care team. That's very stressful, and I can't help but think how much that's going to disrupt someone's physiology. And if you're at the pointy end of sharp, with an athlete like this who, runs a marathon low 220, that's going to really throw a wrench in the system, right? That's going to disrupt their sleep. They're going to be perseverating over what's going to happen. Is their livelihood at stake? And if you don't identify that as a stressor, and you're trying to help someone manage their running related injury, all bets are off. So I think it's really just looking at this person from a 360-degree lens, and that goes with every athlete. And to also appreciate that they may not be so forthcoming when you meet them until they really get to trust you, and then they start sharing things that have a lot of salience to their situation. So, I think a lot of these injuries are treated very much from a silo, and you have to look at that person in their totality.
So how do you use that practically as an athlete, self-coach athlete, or as a coach? If we go by that premise that we need to treat an athlete as an ecosystem and take all of those factors into account, which of course we do. But how do you do that practically? If you have some stressful situation in your life, what is your practical recommendation? Is it to reduce volume, reduce intensity, or to just maybe increase sleep if you can do that? Or do you have any other practical things that you would advise athletes to do in that situation?
Yeah, so I would put it back on the athlete. And I think that's something that is not always done. So I would say, look, we want to protect consistency of training at all costs, because otherwise all these adaptations that you've systematically built will fall by the wayside. So I would say, what are the levers that you think we need to pull right now? What's the low-hanging fruit? Can we improve your sleep? Can we get you drinking a little bit more water? From a training standpoint, I think the main thing is to pull back on intensity and to not force the issue. So before we hopped on, you were saying how, you have a young son, right? So, I would say, look, be loose. If you're tired, you had a bad night's sleep, say your son was up sick, that next day, don't force or stick with what's on the schedule if someone's programming for you. Maybe just get out for a walk or do an hour low intensity spin. And I think that if you can ebb and flow with your energy and the things that you're challenging on facing on a day-to-day basis, that's how you get through these yellow light times in life, and you get back to green light times where you can push. Intensity is what gets a lot of endurance athletes into trouble, especially with running. The faster you run, the greater the forces. So you need to enter those workouts with a high state of readiness. And I think a lot of us in endurance sports, especially triathlon, we're very type A. We're going to get things done through hell or high water. And I think that oftentimes backfires on us.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree with that. And that's, you have to almost fight your personality when you know that you have a period like that with some kind of stress, or because that what drives us to do this sport is often that willingness to suffer a little bit. We enjoy it. And so then it's just easy not easy, but it's kind of doable to think that, well, I'm not feeling my best, but I'm going to get this done. But it's about knowing when it does and doesn't make sense. And even one thing that I was thinking of with some of my athletes who sometimes have variable work schedules, or not necessarily schedules, but work responsibilities, where periods of their working life are extremely busy, and I know that sometimes they don't quite have time to eat even. So if you try to do intensity when you have been working a 10-12 hour day and you haven't had a proper meal during that time, then that's another situation that could, not just the stress itself, but just the fact that you're doing some intensity without having adequate energy on board, is also probably going to be a huge increase in injury risk, right?
Yeah, and I think that, naturally that's going to bring up the topic of bone stress injuries, because if you're trying to push and you're not nourishing and fueling your body, that quickly can become a medical issue, right? So, yeah, I think, just to remind people you can still train hard and train consistently, but also recognize points in life where, they are yellow light time, and just pull back a little bit. And I think that that's invaluable. And that's tricky with a lot of athletes. Like you said, part of what allows people to have success in this sport is to grind and to push through. So, when I'm working with athletes, maybe we talk about heart rate variability. Maybe we say, hey, look, this session that you did, this is what it looked like 2 weeks ago. And man, your heart rate's really high. Or, it seemed like your power trailed off. So I think this is where really understanding the data that people are collecting and prioritizing to apply it, to really look at their situation objectively, because if you don't, they may end up making a hasty decision and going through with a workout that leaves them in the hole, right?
Yeah. I think it's also one other thing that can be useful to think of as a mental model is that I believe a lot of athletes feel that the intense sessions are really important, really impactful, that they're the main driver of how they're going to progress. But in reality, like, that's the icing on the cake more than anything. It's whereas the low intensity work is what's going to bring you, at least 80% of the improvement, maybe 80% of the work and 80% of the improvement, or 90% of the improvement. It's still an aerobic sport and getting that aerobic volume done. So with that being said, you're not necessarily losing much. You're losing more of a marginal gain layer by making an intense session, a low intensity session instead. But you're protecting your consistency potentially if you do that in what you call a yellow light period of, or yellow light time. So that's, I think, valuable to think of as well.
Yeah, to give a shout out, there's a brilliant coach, PhD, Dan Cleather, and he has a beautiful quadrant system that talks about fatigue considerations and readiness requirements. So, you had mentioned, hey, you have someone that has an intense session on their schedule and maybe they didn't fuel appropriately. Maybe they're even carrying a little bit of residual fatigue, or they had a poor night's sleep. That's a time where you want that athlete to pivot, right? Because that workout is going to take a lot more out of them than they take away from it. And that's when people start getting the scales tipped. And that's when I really worry about people, obviously with bone stress injuries, but any kind of MSK complaint, right? So if you have, what Dan refers to, what I refer to as a hot session, meaning intensity, right? You need to make sure you're going into that with a high state of readiness, not just stick to what's on the schedule because someone has programmed it out, whether that's if you're self-coaching yourself or if you have someone who's mapping out your programming. I always joke with my friends. They're like, what are you training today? And I say, I'll tell you when I get up in the morning, because I have to see how I feel. Like today, I feel great, so maybe I push a little bit, not too much, right? And there are other days where yesterday morning, I said, I'm just going to go for an easy conversation pace run, extend my walking warm up and walking cool down, and just check the box, and that's it, right?
Yeah. Other than making the right decisions, potentially adjusting things in the yellow light periods, what are some other things that lead to injuries, or let's say that you can do to avoid injuries? What about things like strength training and even in running? Maybe there are smaller things that we should also touch on, like the impact of footwear, the impact of the terrain that you're running on, and the ground surface. Can we talk about some of these other factors as well that might have an impact on injuries?
Yeah, so I do think strength training is really important. And I think it's also important to understand anytime I'm working with someone, I want to know where they're coming from in life, right? Is this someone, for example, I was on a call with someone this morning who may potentially consult me for physical therapy. And they said, sorry, I'm getting distracted because alerts are popping up saying I lost my connection. But this fellow he did not come from an active background. He was not playing multi-directional sports growing up. He doesn't have any experience in a weight room. That's a very different conversation than, say, someone like myself who comes from a multi-sport background where I was playing pretty much every sport in the book. I have extensive experience in a weight room, is having played competitive tennis. So I think you need to really understand who this athlete is that you're dealing with. Strength training is really important. You had mentioned that because, I almost look at it as sort of fortifying your musculoskeletal system. And that's particularly important for any master's level athletes who start to lose capacity, really probably late 30s, but 40 and above, especially if we're talking about runners in the calf muscle complex. So, I think that if there's anything that one is doing from an activity standpoint out of staying on top of wellness factors and doing swim, bike, run, if we stick with the theme of triathlon, it's to incorporate some lifts. Now, the tricky thing there is that's one more thing that you're going to have to make sure that you're fueling the system appropriately. So with a lot of the strength training programs for triathletes, they can't be too extensive because that creates a very big energy bill. And if someone is not fueling and nourishing their body, that becomes problematic. And that's how a lot of bone stress injuries get kicked into motion.
When you say extensive there, Chris, do you mean, is that just the total load? So reps times weight tonnage, or is there a difference if you're talking about higher reps, moderate weights versus higher weight, lower reps? What do you mean by extensive?
Really, people who have a laundry list of exercises. So I consulted a fellow who we were concerned that he had a tibial bone stress injury, and he was more of a road and trail runner. But I would say, what are you doing? And it was 5 big lifts, and he was doing sometimes 3 to 4 sets of 10 to 12 reps, right? Versus someone who may do a compound lift, maybe a plyometric activity and a single leg lift. That's going to be much less. I wouldn't say demanding, but it's not going to require the same type of fueling to accommodate the energy requirements for that. That's why plyometrics for a lot of younger runners in particular are great, because they don't have a huge energy expenditure. So you can get someone doing, say, 40 to 60 contacts and then go off and do a run. So it's a bone building activity that is not creating a big energy bill that they're going to have to pay. So, I think that's a really important thing. And also having deload weeks. I think a lot of endurance athletes, once you get the bug, that you just want to train year round, right? And I think that becomes a slippery slope. I think especially if someone has a history of bone stress injuries, you need to have calculated deload weeks. Where someone is maybe running 3 to 4 weeks, and then they have a week where they just dramatically pull back, where they're cutting their volume in half, pulling back on intensity to just allow their bones to catch up, because you can easily outpace targeted remodeling, right? And I think footwear, just variability more than anything, having different shoes in your rotation. Malisu and colleagues show that has the potential to reduce the risk of a running-related injury by 39%, with the concept being you're just exposing the body to variable internal and external forces and calling on it to adapt.
How many shoes in the rotation was in that study? Was it just 2 or?
The title was Parallel Use of Different Running Shoes, but it's different styles, different brands, right? So I think stuff like that is helpful. If we think about running, maybe one day it's fine if you want to run on the treadmill, another day on the road, another day getting out on some rolling terrain or some soft pack. I think those are all simple, strategies that one can take to help mitigate the risk of injury. But I also remind folks, the best athletes in the world who have all of the medical and performance personnel still get injured, right? Maybe they're not accounting for the allostatic load that they're having to deal with, right? So, not factoring in things beyond training.
Yeah. Coming back to the ground surface that you're running on, do you prescribe to you mentioned the variation there. So is that what you think is advantageous to mix it up, different kinds of terrain, even rolling versus flat and treadmill sometimes, or because there is that school of thought to always try to run on softer surfaces if possible. I know I did talk with Max Paquette, who I'm sure you're familiar with, and he didn't. He said that the evidence doesn't necessarily support that. But what are your thoughts anecdotally on how ground surface has an impact, if any, on injury prevention?
Yeah, I would say you have to be careful of surfaces that are too supple. I consulted someone, and this is a little bit more of an extreme case, but who was doing an ultra, and the final segment of the race finished on sand on a beach. That really can create a strike against you, especially if you have a history of Achilles tendinopathy. So, I think variability is the key there, right? I have a friend who's a brilliant physio, does a lot of work with, high level runners, Matt Walsh, who's in Portland. And one of my favorite sayings is repetitively hitting the ground in the same manner is not a healthy running strategy. Now, the reality is you never take the same contact twice, but, I think it's a good reminder for people. I think treadmill is great for people coming off of bone stress injury, especially if it's a tibia, because the strains are much less in overground running. But yeah, I think just having some variability over the course of a week is a good thing.
And if somebody they have some kind of niggle, it just pops up on a run. I think let's stick to the run here because it's the most common one, and it doesn't feel too bad, but you can feel that something is there, something is bothering you a bit. How do you manage that situation? What's your decision-making framework with regard to pain and niggles?
Yeah, this comes back to knowing the athlete. So, what's this athlete's past medical history? If that niggle is over a region that is not a tendon and they have a history of a bone stress injury, you need to be vigilant in monitoring that. So, there's a couple heuristics. You mentioned Max Paquette. He's published a lot with Rich Willey, who's another brilliant researcher. And Stu Warden and Brent Edwards, I believe, published an article, and they talked about, numeric pain rating scales and what's acceptable. So if you're working with someone who doesn't have a history of bone stress injury, and this is pain that's localized over a tendon, I'm okay if someone's working through some low level stable pain. So what's low level? Really probably anywhere from 1 to even upwards of 5 out of 10 if we go off of a 0 to 10 scale. So long as they're not adopting altered mechanics and the symptoms subside and return to baseline by the following morning. If someone has pain that's not over a tendon and there was no traumatic mechanism of injury, and they do have a remarkable past medical history for a bone stress injury, that's something you need to be vigilant with, right? Because we say like 0 to 1 out of 10 is the only acceptable pain in that situation. Because if you're dealing with bone, it's a little bit more volatile, and you have to identify that early and get people to take a U-turn, right? So I think having blanket rules across the board, it's okay, but you need to know who this athlete is. So, for any coaches that are tuning in, really take the time to have a non-rushed conversation and make sure that you cover past medical history, whether that's someone will have an ankle sprain and think that's just this innocuous thing that, I just sprained my ankle. I've never sprained my ankle. And I've seen that lead to a whole slew of issues if it goes incompletely rehabbed. Does this person have a history of lower limb tendinopathy? Do they have a history of bone stress injuries? Were these low risk, high risk sites? Has there ever been a compromised relationship with food, whether that be unintentional underfueling, disordered eating, or maybe even a medically diagnosed eating disorder? So I always really want to make sure that when I first start working with a patient or an athlete that I know where they're coming from and I don't rush through that conversation because it'll always come back to bite me in the ass in terms of helping them navigate stuff.
Yeah, yeah. And when you said that you want the pain to, if it's a tendon, pain in a tendon, that you want it to return to baseline by the next morning, is that someday is the first day of the pain appearing, right? So in the morning, it was probably at a zero, baseline was zero, then you get some pain on your run. You want it basically to return to zero overnight and wake up feeling good again, and that then it's okay? Or is it, at what point is some light pain in the morning, is that ever okay or not?
Yeah, if that's their baseline, there are certain people I've worked with who have had ongoing lower limb tendon issues, right? And you sort of need to identify where they are on the spectrum, and there's different buckets that we've created. But with a lot of the endurance athletes, I would say these tend to be a little bit more load induced. Not to say that it can't be a systemic factor or factors at play. But yeah, I just want to make sure that if they go out on a run, I'm okay with some low level stable pain if we have the utmost confidence that this is not a bone stress injury, and that those symptoms the following morning when they wake up have gone back to baseline. If their baseline's a zero, great. That could just be they're early on in the process. But if they start having symptoms that spill over and persist that following day, I start to say, we probably did too much. So let's really pull back, maybe take a couple days off. And again, if it's the Achilles, for example, we want to minimize speed work, probably being on a treadmill and running uphill. And this is where certain guardrails come in because we want to protect consistency of training.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Are there other heuristics like that you have with other common running related injuries, overuse injuries?
Not necessarily. I think that's a really good one. In just to know who the athlete is and what you're dealing with. You had brought up Rasmus, and early on when he got sidelined with his bone stress injury last year around this time, a little bit later in the spring, that's a situation where you're saying, look, he wasn't able to walk pain free, so he needs to go to the next level, which in his case, it was a very deliberate deload where he went a couple weeks non-weight bearing to really facilitate a healing response. So yeah, it's just putting these guardrails in place and letting the dust settle. Now, the unfortunate reality is sometimes, especially with masters level athletes, if they've dealt with, I've dealt with various flavors of patellar tendinopathy. Sometimes, this is weeks, if not months, of managing that athlete and having guardrails in place while you're loading the tissue and trying to get it to adapt. So, but yeah, that study that was in the Journal of Orthopedic Sports Physical Therapy 2022, and people have adapted it, but that's a graph and a figure that I share with all of my athletes because my goal is to empower people so they take ownership of their own training. So at some point, if they're not working with me, that they can start making better decisions to keep them training.
Yeah, I'll ask you to send that article to me after, and then I'll put a link in the show notes so listeners can go and have a look at that. Other than strength training, is there other prehab preventive work that you think is beneficial? Like, for example, should athletes be stretching, whether it's static or dynamic? Should they be doing foam rolling or doing different kinds of recovery modalities or massages? Are there any of these other things that you think are, at least in certain situations, valuable?
I don't prioritize any of the modalities that you just mentioned. I also don't battle with athletes if they tell me that they find foam rolling or stretching sort of calming, and maybe it's a way to down regulate after a session. That's fine, but I'm always trying to whittle people's programs down because I think, wherever you're allocating your energy, you're having to relinquish it elsewhere. So I would much rather someone remove a lot of these, what I think of as, tertiary, interventions or modalities, and, focus on the things that are going to really push the needle. To me, recovery is spending time, like if we talk about recovery, like to me, it's spending time with my family, maybe sitting in the tub and reading, maybe meditating at some point during the day. I find that stuff helpful, so, stretching is something that a lot of endurance athletes do because they see, especially runners, they see other runners doing it. But, the reality is most of these endurance athletes if they're stretching, they're maybe doing it for like 10 to 15 seconds. You're not making any kind of significant changes. If you want to really learn a ton about stretching in a very short period of time, my former mentor, Mal McHugh, who would be a brilliant person for you guys to have on the podcast, he did just a short video that I think was part of a TED talk or series on stretching. And I can send you that link. And it goes over, it's like a crash course in the science. But there's no research to show that stretching does anything for injury prevention with endurance athletes. So if you're going to do anything, focus on strength training. But if someone enjoys stretching and you don't think it's interfering or perhaps sensitizing a tendon if they have a lower limb tendinopathy, I don't battle with people, right? I may challenge them a little bit to say, hey, that may not be the best use of your time. What value are you finding in it? And if they say, oh, it's kind of relaxing, I say, that's fine, right?
Yeah. No, that makes sense. And if you do, like you have been injured, you're working through it, you're starting to get better, what is your recommended way of approaching the return to running? What kind of protocols would you use? And I'm sure that it depends on various factors, but let's tease that apart a little bit.
Yeah, so I think what do a lot of the endurance athletes, we'll stick with runners and triathletes, what do they deal with in terms of injury? They deal with, they can deal with muscle strains, they deal with lower limb tendinopathy and bone stress injuries. That's pretty much the crux of what I see. So if I'm working someone back into running after, say, a bone stress injury, I was on a call with a guy yesterday, I am very conservative because, Stu Warden uses this term. When you're reintroducing running, these are controlled bone loading sessions. Yes, I guess it falls under training, but it's really getting people to reconceptualize what they're doing with running. This is one time where you have to be really avoid using rating of perceived exertion, because people may start feeling good, especially a triathlete who's been cycling a lot. Their cardiovascular system is ready, but their MSK system, musculoskeletal system, is not. So I am very conservative where I'm saying, okay, you need to get through all activities of daily living. You need to tolerate 45 to 60 minutes of brisk walking, 3.2 to 3.5 miles per hour, 5.2 to 5.6 kilometers per hour with arms pumping on rolling terrain before we even entertain the notion of reintroducing running. And there's a lot of other, boxes that I would want to check. But with someone who has a bone stress injury, I'm going to start them 1 minute run, 4 minute walk, repeat that 5 more times or 6 in total. I want them to check that level of running at least 2, if not 3 times before we advance them to 2 minutes of running to 3 minutes of walking. So I just want to be very judicious, systematic, and non-rushed with someone coming off of a bone stress injury, right? With someone who has a lower limb tendinopathy, for example, back to the Achilles, since we see that a lot with runners, I may be a little bit more willing to nudge so long as we understand the loads that are, or the types of runs or terrain that are going to bias a load to the Achilles tendon calf muscle complex. I would probably keep someone off of a treadmill. If they are on a treadmill, I would want to make sure they keep it at 0% incline, because if they put it at 1%, you're shifting the load to the calf and Achilles tendon, right? Which you already are if you're on a treadmill to start. I would keep people away from a zero drop shoe. That would be the same case whether it's the Achilles tendon or someone who has a tibial bone stress injury or a metatarsal bone stress injury, because muscle has the greatest stimulus on bone. So if you go into a zero drop shoe, you're increasing plantar flexor forces. So it's understanding a lot of the stuff that's been published in the literature on this from folks like Rich, from Max Paquette, and learning how to bake it into, the advice and the guardrails that you're putting into place. And those don't need to be long term, but short term, because you're trying to reestablish consistency of training. And if you can't do that, all bets are off.
Yeah, that's really good. Coming back to that bone stress return to run protocol, you go from 1 minute run to 4 minute 1 minute run, 4 minute walk 6 times to 2 minute run, 3 minute walk. Can you repeat how many times do you say that you repeat each of those sessions before you advance? And then the second part of my question is, what is the rough estimation for how long it would take from somebody doing that first 1 minute run, 4 minute walk session to being able to run, let's say, if they're used to doing well over 1 hour runs regularly, to at least doing a 1 hour easy run, continuous run? How many weeks should they expect as a rough estimate?
Yeah. So, to answer your first question, so I'll start people with a 1 minute run to a 4 minute walk, and you'll see a little bit of variability. The original Return to Run program that Stu Warden put out in 2014 was very conservative, but he also is probably allowing people to run maybe a little bit sooner based on some of the, the things that he's published, where he's saying 1 minute run to 9 minute walk and then going 2 minute run to 8 minute walk. But he also made a comment in one of his papers that once someone is pain-free for 5 to 7 days in the context of a low-risk bone stress injury, he's allowing them to return to running. I don't do that. I've never found that to be effective, and maybe he's working with a different population. But so I want people to pass all the physical performance tests that I use that are part of a test battery, and I can send you that PDF for viewers or listeners. And once someone's able to get through all activities of daily living, 45 to 60 minutes of brisk walking, as I mentioned, I start them on that return to run program. Now, I also, in the context of a bone stress injury, I want to make sure that, if we're working with females, that their menstrual function has returned, that they have a fueling plan in place, that their blood work checks out. And if you want to take a deep dive on this, the female athlete triad consensus paper was just updated recently, but it's really looking at the person as a whole. And then obviously we're getting a little bit more in the weeds with the running stuff, but I want people to check each of those return to run levels at least 2, if not 3 times. So sometimes you'll hear the rule of 2s, which is basically prove tolerance to each level twice before advancing to the next one. And you're going to do these generally on non-consecutive days when you first do this. So, the athlete who I'm working with who has a tibial bone stress injury that I spoke to yesterday, I'll have them run Monday, Wednesday, Friday, maybe Sunday. Or maybe Sunday I'll just have them go out on a walk on rolling terrain. So you really need to be conservative, because that's a very volatile time in the rehab process, is when you start getting someone back into consistent training. And just to remind people, bone is slow going, right? So, if you try to rush that process, you're going to end up right back where you started.
Yeah. So about the female athlete triad, I did interview Margot Mountjoy a couple of years ago. I can't remember exactly when it was.
Yeah, she's a huge researcher in the space.
And that was when one of those consensus papers had been updated from the IOC. But I don't know, when you say recently updated, was it just recently, or was it recently as in 2-3 years ago?
No. So last month, I believe is when it was published. Yeah, and these are thick papers, right?
Yeah.
And this is such a complex topic, and we're still learning so much. So, and just while we're on this topic, you have to have a team in place. And I was talking to a pro triathlete recently, and it's overwhelming when someone is dealing with a bone stress injury. It's not only overwhelming, it's also expensive, because you need to have a physical therapist or a rehab professional. You need to perhaps have a physician. You're going to have a registered dietitian. You may have a coach in the mix. Like, it almost becomes a full-time job. And here we are discussing energy availability. Well, where is all that energy coming from that you're having to allocate to meeting with all these professionals, the stress of the finances related to it? This doesn't get discussed a lot. So I am always very calculated in who I have these athletes see. I want to make sure they have a comprehensive team, but I'm saying, who is the most important person that they see right off the bat? And, oftentimes it's going to be get them into their primary care for some blood work, and to probably get them connected with a registered dietitian, right? Maybe an orthopedist if we need to get imaging, but that depends on whether it's a low risk, high risk site, the other factors that enter the equation, their past medical history in terms of how many bone stress injuries have they had. So you have to start really turning over a lot of stones.
So are you saying there are situations where you don't need imaging for a bone stress injury? You can diagnose it in other ways?
Yeah, I would say that a lot of the pros just have connections where they'll get in and they'll get imaging. I want to know what's going on. I don't want to guess, because the more clarity, there's enough moving parts where I want as much clarity as I can get. Now, with that said, if someone has focal pain over, the lower part of their leg, the lower inner part of their leg, or the posterior medial tibia, distal third, and they have palpable tenderness, where you're pushing on the bone and it's less than 5 centimeters, so the size of like a AA battery or chapstick, and they have pain with hopping and running is not going to plan, I'm saying this is probably a tibial bone stress injury, right? And I may not shuttle them off for imaging. Same with a low risk metatarsal bone stress injury. You'll get confirmation. You'll know that this is probably a bone stress injury if you remove running or impact activities and things start to settle and improve. That's confirmation that, this is probably a bone stress injury that you were dealing with. And a lot of athletes don't have the luxury of getting an MRI, right? But if we're dealing with, there was a woman who had reached out to me and she was having some groin and hip pain. That is a situation where I do not want to screw around, because, that has, and she was a competitive swimmer growing up who's morphed into triathlon. So I worry about her bone density because she was sort of a sea creature. She's not, accustomed to dealing with axial load. And that's a situation where I absolutely want to get her in for an MRI, which has 100% sensitivity and specificity to know what we're dealing with, because you're going to have to probably have that person go on crutches for at least 4, if not 6 weeks. And people, I think as an athlete, you're sort of in denial about this. So you may not be so forthcoming with what you're experiencing. And then a lot of rehab providers may not have these top of mind. And that's how, a bone stress injury can get south on you really quick.
Yeah, I mean, that I have heard about, or there have been some high profile, either undiagnosed or misdiagnosed bone stress injuries in the triathlon world and in the endurance world as well. So what is your advice for a non-professional athlete, an age group athlete listening who maybe don't have the same access to a team, but on the other hand, they might even have a better access. Often they have perhaps a better financial situation than a professional athlete. But regardless, what is your advice to avoid a situation where you have an undiagnosed or improperly diagnosed bone stress injury?
Well, to know that these are very common. So I mentioned, as someone who's sort of niched down at this point in my career and working with runners and triathletes, I see lower limb tendon issues, bone stress injuries, and muscle strains. So these have a pretty common presentation. So, there are also, indicators, for example. So, you're a young, healthy male, you should be getting morning erections, right? So, and this is something that a lot of healthcare professionals and coaches may not be comfortable broaching. So I want to say, hey, how are you feeling? With athletes that come in, if they look tired, if, their numbers are going in the wrong direction, if they're not bringing food into the appointment with me, those are all things where my antenna shoot up if they're not having pain that's over a tendinous region. So, with a lot of, the males I work with, there's a specific line of questioning, and it's similar but different with females. So, with males, are you getting morning erections, right? How is your energy? How is your libido, right? Walk me through your fueling plan. With a lot of the women, I'm asking about menstrual function. How old were they when they got their period? Has it been consistent? What's the exact number of days between cycles? So I think a lot of these things can just be picked up if athletes are self-aware, or if they're working with a coach, that you just have a candid conversation about this stuff and not let it be awkward. I think when you first start asking these questions, you may not phrase them or, bring them up exactly, in the best of ways. So for coaches that are listening, I just say, or rehab professionals, when I approach these questions, I say, look, I want to really understand what we're dealing with. And, to do that, I'm going to ask you a bunch of questions. And some of these are questions that no one else has perhaps posed to you. So if you're uncomfortable with anything, by all means, you don't need to answer it. But this will really help me paint a picture of your general health and what's going on, right? And that way, you sort of give people an out if they are uncomfortable talking about it. There's a couple women that I work with here in the States who are colleagues. They'll talk about, for a lot of the female endurance athletes, painful sex, right? These are just conversations that don't get brought up for a variety of reasons that need to be that you have to have these if you're working with athletes. Because again, the sooner you can identify this stuff, the faster you can sort of right the ship.
So would you say that more often than not, a bone stress injury is accompanied by one of those indicators, like loss of or irregular menstrual function, or lack of morning erections, or low libido, or those main canaries in the coal mine, if you will, that you mentioned? Is that common, or is it something that can happen but it doesn't necessarily happen when you have a bone stress injury?
I think oftentimes there are warning signs, and it just requires an astute coach and clinician who has good communication lines, who is also looking at the data, but also having conversations, not relying solely on the data. So, when I talk to athletes, if they seem, irascible, or they're frustrated, or I just sense that they're tired, to me, I'm saying pay close attention, right? Let's look at their workloads and see how they're responding to some of this stuff. So this just requires a lot of time and vigilance too, if you're working with athletes.
Yeah.
And changes in schedule. I don't want to sit here and pretend like I get all this stuff right. I mean, I'll share, I sustained my first bone stress injury last year around this time. And, I think there are a couple X factors. If you look at my background, I created the perfect environment, played multi-sport, never focused on running until I really got into my like early 20s. I've always stayed on top of sleep. We're a very food first family. I'm very well versed in the research, knowing the signs, symptoms, but I was working on a big project last year, and I went out on a run. I was in a pair of shoes that, in hindsight, I think were part of the equation. But the calcaneus, which is your heel bone, is more of a trabecular rich bone. What I mean by that, it's spongy bone, right? So it's very susceptible to energy availability. So I had sort of forced a shift in my circadian rhythms because I was working on this project. I usually get to sleep at 10 o'clock at night. I always get like at least 7 to 8 hours of sleep, but for whatever reason, force overtook me to get this project done. And I started going to sleep closer to 11:30, 12, sometimes 12:30. And even though I was sleeping in and still staying on top of fueling and even pulling back with my workloads, that was enough to create an imbalance. And that was 12 weeks of zero running, right? And then, I've been able to get on the other side of it, but it was through, getting back to a normal sleep regimen. So I think just really talk to athletes, not only about their workloads and their training, but life outside of that, other stressors, factors that they think tie in, and really make sure that you're auditing their fueling program, because people may think that they're doing a good job, but there's an energy mismatch.
That was going to be my next question. How do you audit an athlete's fueling program? And also here a follow-up then, a self-coach athlete at home listening to this, how can they self-audit their fueling program?
Yeah, so I tell everyone, I'm kind of dangerous because I sat next to a nutritionist when I was in New York at the Nicholas Institute of Sports Medicine, a woman named Beth Glace. So I would just talk to her all the time, and I absorbed a lot. And she also does a lot of. She's another person you guys could have on. She does a lot of research trying to demystify fatigue mechanisms in endurance athletes, central versus peripheral. And I also am good friends with Becca McConville, who's a world-class registered dietitian whose whole focus is on energy availability. So my role is not to give advice. It's to screen and say, do I think that there's a fueling issue here? And then get that athlete into the appropriate hands, which is someone like a Beth, a Marnie Sumball, a Becca McConville, who can then really audit and start to map things out. So I just talk to athletes. I say, hey, walk me through a typical day. Because I think, kill my phone. I think athletes have, they have daily routines and rituals. So, hey, when you wake up in the morning, walk me through your day. And they'll say, oh, well, I go out for an 8 to 10 mile run. And I'm like, okay, before you do that run, are you taking on any fuel? No, I do most of those fasted. Flag, right? If a 30-minute run, 45-minute run, maybe I'm a little bit less concerned. But if someone's going out for an hour plus run, especially if there's any intensity and they're training fasted, that's a problem to me, because you've really been fasting since the night before, right? So, because you're sleeping. So I would even want to know, hey, do you eat a bowl of cereal the night before? So, but I want them to walk me through their typical routine and really zoom in on when they're training, how they're fueling in and around those training sessions. Is there anything that they've developed an aversion to that they haven't had an issue with in the past? Do they have any food allergies? Are they taking time? I talk to a lot of athletes and they say, I just get so busy, I have to work through lunch. And I'm like, that's not good. So they're rushing through fueling themselves. I want to know about carbohydrate use, going into sessions, as well as intra-session, if they're going to be on the bike for 90 plus minutes or if they're going out for a longer run. So I think that through having a conversation like that, where you get a lens into how they're approaching fueling, then you start to get an idea, right? And if I'm working with a competitive athlete and I have any suspicion that they're not paying the energy bill, I'm going to recommend them to connect with someone and I may say, hey, look, I think that something that you can do to improve your performance is to really zoom in on your fueling. I don't talk about calories. I talk about nourishing your body, fueling it for the demands that you're calling on your body to do or to perform.
Yeah. In a potential self-audit that an athlete at home might make, let's say that they don't do fasted training, they hit all their meals. How would they know if they potentially are just not getting enough calories through that? Like they're just not quite eating enough? Is there any way of at least screening for that, understanding that they might need to talk to somebody who might diagnose that with more precision?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are resources out there. I think the athlete's plate is one of them, just to see like what a sensible, fueling strategy looks like. And just to remind people, a diet is what you eat, not what you restrict. But I think to just follow a lot of these trusted resources online, to just see what they're talking about and some of the things that that they may mention. So someone like Becca McConville, she's very generous with a lot of her knowledge. Go give her a follow on Instagram and you will learn so much. Asker Jukendrup, another brilliant mind in this space who is well published and shares a lot of thoughts on the topic. I think just to sort of get exposed to what these experts are talking about, because I think what I see a big problem is a lot of the literature that's published doesn't trickle down to the people who need it most, so. But I think if you're ever feeling tired or lethargic or you're not hitting your numbers, that should start to cause your antenna to go up to say, is this a fueling issue?
Yeah. I want to get into strength training as well, because we could talk about injuries for hours and we could talk about strength training for hours, but let's hit some of the main things around strength training and how you view that. So if we start with, you already said to avoid overloading strength training and to avoid having a laundry list of exercises when you're already imposing a large load of endurance sport on the body. Are there any other overarching principles that you would consider very important when it comes to strength training for an endurance athlete?
Yeah, I think to, again, know from an age standpoint. So if I'm working with a younger athlete, this is a time where their bones are in a very, growth first state. So, this is when I am prioritizing more plyometrics, so that's going to sort of disturb the bone to adapt, right? With skeletally mature adults, I'm trying to get them ultimately lifting a little bit heavier, right? Especially if they're coming off of injury and there are no precautions. So, what we see with a lot of the lower limb tendinopathy is, when people say develop Achilles tendinopathy, that oftentimes they'll lose stiffness in the tendon. And, you won't get that tendon to adapt if you're doing, lighter loads, higher reps, which is a default that a lot of endurance athletes end up doing. So, you want to work with higher contraction intensities. So, 70% of, say, a 1 rep max, or, even working upwards of 90% of a 1 rep max. And to really target the tissues and regions. So, most of the triathletes that I work with, it's running that gets them into trouble. Yeah, maybe they develop some swimmer shoulder. With cycling, it's generally a traumatic accident like a clavicle fracture or contusion. So even among all the triathletes that I consult, it's generally running that gets them into trouble. So, I think that getting them to lift a little bit heavier, and as I always say, load the tissue with the issue. So if someone's coming off of an Achilles tendinopathy, to leverage something like a Smith machine, or, a you can use the soleus machine. I tend to challenge a lot of the athletes with their knee straight in a little bit of dorsiflexion. But yeah, I think, challenging people with heavier loads, which they often shy away from.
And what sort of rep ranges would you do with those kinds of heavier loads?
Yeah, so I think before we get into that, contraction type, we used to always give a lot of people eccentric heel drops, and I think there's definitely folks that responded to that, especially if it was a non-insertional Achilles issue. But that tendon sees tension. The fundamental cell of a tendon's a tenocyte, so that responds to tensile load. So, we're gonna prioritize a combination of isometric exercises, which the calf behaves in a quasi-isometric manner with running in the first place, or heavy, slow resistance, right? Because if plyos are not great for eliciting adaptations with the tendon because the load happens too fast. So with a lot of the isometric loading, most of the time when I'm programming for someone, I'm doing anywhere from 5-second holds up to 15-second holds for the most part. Sometimes I'll go up to 30-second holds. But with rep ranges, I would say if you're working between probably 5 to 15 reps, when I say 15 reps, that's your 15 rep max where you can't do any more. I would say you're probably doing meaningful work. I don't think we know enough to get so precise. And I see that happening a lot with a lot of coaches and clinicians. And, I think that's sort of a false precision. My main concern is that we're directly loading that tissue. We're putting it in the crosshairs through an exercise. So if it's a patellar tendon, to use a knee extension machine. If it's the Achilles tendon, that you're using something like a Smith machine, where you're giving that tendon no place to hide. And that's not to say I'm not going to give something like a step up or a linkage type exercise where you're sort of integrating it into the kinetic chain. But I think a lot of the times people aren't doing focal loading. And, I do think that's important as part of the rehab process and just, to promote healthy tendons in the first place.
Would you do the isometric and concentric heavy slow resistance work concurrently, or would you do it sequentially with starting with, if we're talking about an athlete that's rehabbing an injury, starting with isometrics and then graduating to heavy slow resistance?
No, I think that they can, from the literature that has been published that I'm aware of, what I would say is don't treat isometrics as a rite of passage. And I want to give Peter Malieres credit for, I think he was the one who first made that statement, who's a brilliant researcher, another person would be great for the podcast. But I think that people used to treat isometrics as a rite of passage to move on to isotonics or heavy slow resistance. And I think that that's unnecessary. So I'm usually doing a combination of things as far as loading up these tendons.
Yeah, got it. If we have an athlete that is not injured, so a runner or triathlete, how do you view strength training in that situation? What are the exercises or the muscle groups, the joints that you're targeting, and also what sort of periodization would you recommend in that situation?
Yeah, so as far as what tissues to load up, I think you look at the performance demands of any sport. So with running, the classic study that gets heavily referenced is the one from Dorn et al. That was Journal of Experimental Biology 2012. And it basically shows, calves, quads, outer hip, right? These are the tissues and regions that we want to challenge. So, and especially with distance runners, Brad Beer, who you probably know, he always says below the knee is key. And, if you look at the Hamner and Delp study, that, roughly 50% of the energy for distance running comes from the calf muscle complex. So, I think that getting some focal loading through that is important, with it becoming that much more important with masters level runners who start to lose calf capacity, which isn't offset by other muscle groups in the lower extremity.
Let me follow up on that one, Chris, with masters athletes losing calf capacity. Are you saying there that they basically lose calf capacity more quickly than capacity in other muscle groups, like in the hamstring or in the quad? Okay.
Yeah, and that's that's one of the main reasons why. There's a fellow I've worked with in the past who's awesome. He's 90 years old, and I think he's just now giving up long course racing. He said, I don't know if I could keep doing Ironmans. I think I'm just going to stick with half Ironmans. And I'm thinking, I hope I'm still alive at that age. And he runs beautifully, but he has a very short step length, right? And that a lot of that has to do with the fact that he's lost calf power. So any masters level runner that I'm working with, that is front and center, is I'm trying to preserve their calf capacity, which in turn will help preserve their stride length. So yeah, very important to target that with that demographic.
Yeah.
And you had asked me to go back. So when I'm mapping out a program, there's a few ways of explaining this, but I generally will give an athlete a bigger movement, a squat or a deadlift. I may give them a focal exercise, something like a calf raise or a knee extension, especially depending on their past medical history. And then I'll give them a single leg drill that challenges a kinetic chain, and then maybe add an upper body push or pull. So that's sort of the framework that I use. And I love farmer marches for a variety of reasons, but so that's a pretty tidy program. So, for example, I may have someone do some pogo jumps or staggered stance, multi-directional. I may have them go into a trap bar deadlift. I may pair that with a step up, and then maybe give them a knee extension exercise or a calf raise. And then if they want to do some other exercise that they love or they're hell bent on, then I'll let them add that. But I say, if you're in the gym for more than 30 minutes, I think that's unnecessary.
So what sort of, can you dare in that example then, I know you said that it maybe doesn't matter so much if you're in a fairly broad range of rep max, but what would an example be of the number of sets and reps you would do, and how particular are you with recovery between sets?
Yeah, so if we're trying to build strength, I definitely want to afford recovery. So I want a minimum of 2 minutes. So, for example, to take a step back, I think one of the issues that is very important to highlight here is you need to anchor this stuff. So when I work with an athlete, if we're going to get them doing a trap bar deadlift, I want to say, hey, I want you to pick a weight that you can confidently do 10 reps, for example. Go do it, right? I've had people that pick a weight that they could do 30 reps with. And not to say that wouldn't have hypertrophy benefits if they're doing more reps or they're working close to failure. But, with a lot of the endurance athletes, I would first want to anchor that to figure out what their true 10 rep max is, because I'm going to be basing decisions on how I load them as a function of anchoring it to that value. So, for example, if I went out right now, so if I were working with you, I would say, hey, I want to get you doing some deadlifts for X, Y, and Z reasons. I would want to know your background, but to say, assume we're in a full, like a professional gym. I want you to pick a weight that you can confidently get 10 reps before you have any form breakdown. And I want to let that athlete self-select that weight, right? To see what they show up. Because if I invoke what I think they should do, I may way underload them, way overload them. So I want to see what the athlete comes up with. And then I want to test them and watch them do it. And when I see form breakdown, we stop the test. Or if the velocity changes where it's visible to the naked eye, we stop, right? Now we have a data point, okay, that we can build from. So, if I mentioned earlier, if someone's doing work between, say, 5 to 15 reps, you're probably doing some pretty meaningful work, so long as you've taken the time to anchor the weights. And if someone's getting stronger, I think Phil Maffetone, he lives in Portugal, doesn't he?
I did not think so. I may be completely mistaken.
So, but he has, I think he calls it the strength test, which is so stupid simple. If you feel like, the weight becomes easier, add 5 pounds, but first anchor the weight. So if, say, for ease of explanation, you're able to do 10 reps with a weight of, 185, right? Well, when you feel like you're able to get like 12, maybe even more reps, it's saying add more weight to make sure that, we're being precise with the level of resistance.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. I mean, so could you translate that kind of thinking into just a reps in reserve type of prescription?
yeah.
Because I feel like that's maybe a bit more easy to conceptualize, or not conceptualize, but at least to execute without necessarily having to do a 10 rep max test. So, for example, 2 reps in reserve, something like that. Would that be a good prescription?
Absolutely. So I think you would want to pair RPE, rating of perceived exertion, with reps in reserve. So if you say, hey, I want you to work up to an 8 out of 10 RPE with this weight, where you're leaving 2 reps in reserve, that tends to, to be how I think about it. When I map out someone's programming, I may say, hey, I want you to do 10 reps with your 12 rep max. So like, for example, I'll write a bunch of programs today. So for an athlete, I may say, hey, set 1, I want you to do 12 reps with your 15 rep max. Set 2, I want you to do 10 reps with your 12 rep max. Set 3, I want you to do 8 reps with your 10 rep max. So we're sort of leaving 2 reps in reserve. That's a really, pragmatic way of handling things, so long as you first take the time to anchor the load so you know what weights you're dealing with.
Yeah. And with plyometrics, you had the pogo example there in that strength session. Is that something that also for older athletes, even though they don't have the same bone remodeling that you mentioned younger athletes having, would you always want to have some kind of plyometric exercise in a strength workout?
Generally, yes, but I think that you want to use these judiciously, and you need to be very cognizant of how they're interfacing with the HUT session. So, like if someone has intensity, I tend to do these sparingly, and I do tend to put them towards the beginning of the program when I know someone's in a non-fatigue state, and I think their form's going to be better. And also, you hear a lot of talk about, keep the heavy days heavy, or, the hard days hard and the easy days easy. Well, you need to know the athlete you're working with. If I'm working with an athlete who has a history of bone stress injury, the plyos are going to be the most important stimulus. So I want those to be done early in the morning before someone gets up and is moving around and training, especially, because that stimulus, the timing of it becomes important. Because if they go out on, say, a 45 to 60 minute run and they're doing their plyos afterward, the bones are deaf to load at that point. So the question is, what are you doing? Right. But I think there's a notion that plyos are injurious to older athletes. And I would say, maybe haphazard dosing of plyos, but there's no research to show that, plyos are any more dangerous to an athlete if they're dosed sensibly. So with that fellow who I'd mentioned who's 90 years old, that's an integral part of his training, because that's a quality that could very fastly detrain with him, right? So I keep plyos in the mix. Now, I may not have him jump rope. I may have him do something as simple as just some pogo jumps where he's doing double leg pogos, feet side by side, and then maybe staggering his stance with his right foot forward, then switching to left foot, maybe going narrow to wide, toes in, toes out, So I would be biasing that to, the reason I like pogos with older athletes is because they're losing calf capacity and reactive strength. That's a very below the knee dominant exercise versus someone who may have, a history of a proximal bone stress injury, where you'd want to get into some movements that involve greater degrees of flexion and bending forces.
Yeah, like counter movement jump or?
Yeah, counter movement jump, broad jump. So it's tailoring this stuff and customizing it to the individual, knowing that there's no perfect, but you want to have a thought process that drives this between the exercises you're selecting, the loads, the time of day that you're incorporating, and where are you in the season. I tend to focus or prioritize a lot of the strength training work at times of the year where it's not competing with a lot of volume and or intensity. But I tend to always keep some strength training in the mix. I'm just titrating the dosage or the frequency depending on where someone is. So if someone is, 6 weeks out from an Ironman, I'll probably have them strength train once a week and incorporate a lot of movement snacks throughout the day to just sort of keep their body primed. Something like a march to overhead reach. Something as simple as, maybe a hip airplane. And with the pros, the question is, where do you put it? Someone like Rasmus, if he's training 25 hours a week, where do you put the strength? Right?
Yeah.
You have to be very calculated and also make sure that they never have the experience where maybe you got a little bit overzealous and you triggered, for whatever reason, exercise-induced muscle damage, or what people think of as DOMS. Because that person may just stop strength training because they'll say, oh, I did that. I raced flat, or I had a really important week going into this race and I was just sore and my training went to pot. Well, they're not going to have a lot of, they're not going to put a lot of stock in strength training at that point.
Yeah. I mean, that was going to be my final question on strength training. You kind of touched on it already with the periodization, but let me summarize how I interpreted what you said there. So basically, about the periodization, you would throughout a lot of the strength training sessions in themselves would have some element of, you want to load whatever exercise you're doing fairly heavily, like we have talked about, regardless of the time of year. But you would maybe reduce the frequency of the strength sessions when you get closer to a race, and perhaps fewer sets, fewer exercises as well. Is that a correct interpretation?
Yeah, and you may even focus on some faster movements. So I think back to when I was going into Ironman Canada in 2019, which was a race I was really proud of. And, I started going a little bit lighter with my trap bar deadlifts, but focusing on moving faster, right? Most of the time when I'm working with folks, I say, what's a quality that I think that this athlete would benefit from building that's going to lend to improved performance? And with a lot of endurance athletes, if I can just get them a little bit stronger, right? I think that is important. Or if they seem to not have the greatest coordination, I'm going to challenge them with some single leg drills, because if you can't transfer force joint to joint, you don't have the coordination. Well, strength is sort of a freight train off the tracks. You can be strong with bilateral exercises, but if you can't coordinate it, it's not going to lend to improved running performance, right?
Yeah.
So it's just looking at this athlete, and as you take them through a bunch of assessments, you're saying, okay, what are the levers that we need to pull? Is this someone who comes from a very rich background where they were a Division I athlete, say here in the States, or they were a competitive multi-sport athlete? That's someone who probably strength training, still important, may not take on the same salience as someone who has very limited background with strength training.
So I'm going to ask one more question about strength training,
Sure.
since you mentioned the unilateral exercises. And in your example session, you had one unilateral, and you had a compound lift of some kind. So you had a good mix of that. But my question is just, confirming if that is what you think is the right balance, to have a little bit of both, a little bit of bilateral, a little bit of unilateral? Or is there ever a situation where for a runner you focus heavily on unilateral because it might be more specific for them or for the sport that is? What's your take on that?
Yeah, well, I think that, if someone's coming off of a unilateral lower extremity complaint, there are a couple runners that, I work with, and they always say, I just have a case of right side itis where everything hits my right side. Yeah, I definitely want to challenge that. I want to get some baseline data on that athlete too, where I'm objectively strength testing them, which has become much easier with with a lot of advances in the technology. But generally, I'm using bilateral exercises for recruitment's sake, right? You have a broader base to produce force from. Think back to Archimedes. He said, give me a lever in a stable base, and a long enough lever in a stable base, and I'll move the world. So, I think bilateral exercises, you're gonna be in a better position for recruitment, producing greater force. And then with unilateral exercises, you could still overload them for sure. But I tend to prioritize those, to challenge coordination with people, especially if it's a unilateral lower extremity complaint.
Yeah. I know
there's a great paper on. Well, I was going to say there's a great paper on this from Moran and colleagues. It was in Sports Med that talks about bilateral and unilateral exercises. So, but most of my programming, if you look at it, it blends a combination of the two.
Yeah, I was going to ask because we're out of our calendar time, but are you free for a little bit longer to go through some listener questions and some myths? So let's do the listener questions first to make sure we hit them. So people, if you want the chance to ask questions of future guests, give me a follow on Scientific Triathlon HQ on Instagram. That's where I put out the requests for questions. The first one is from Lotta _Mission Triathlon, who asks, "What's your opinion on stretching / black roll? Does it have a preventive impact?"
I would say there's one study that shows that foam rolling in conjunction with a couple other exercises did reduce the risk of running related injuries. And I think that was back in maybe like a couple years back. But generally, there's no compelling research as far as stretching goes. And that's the only study that I'm aware of where foam rolling was part of a program. But what that study essentially showed is the subjects who were compliant with the intervention tended to do well. So you could have given them perhaps anything, as long as they were sticking to something and they had trust in the program that, favorable results occurred. So, but I would say, yeah, probably not the greatest use of your time.
And Ashley Mason asks, "Working with a PT for 2 years, every time I fix an issue, a new one pops up. How can I prehab the future?"
If you're working with a PT for 2 years where you're working in a structured setting, I would say you're probably missing the boat. The goal is to migrate you out of PT and back to consistent and healthy training. If you keep getting injured, I would make sure that someone's really zooming out and looking at all of the moving parts, not only with your training, but the demands of your life. But I would say that if you're dealing with recalcitrant issues, that requires a closer audit because something seems to be falling by the wayside or getting missed.
And Yatsi80 asks, "Isometric hold on Achilles injury. What's your opinion?"
I would say that we don't know. I would say there's some great research from Aram Patsis, Albrecht, Falk Mersman, people doing great stuff. So there's something called the Berlin method, which is 4-second holds using a high contraction intensity, so 90% of a max voluntary isometric contraction. But I would say if you're doing something that is heavy, holding it anywhere from probably 5 to 15 seconds, I think that there's great benefit, especially if we're trying to improve stiffness. With a lower duration, meaning you're using a little bit more weight. So, for example, when I was dealing with my patellar tendon issue, I keep this simple. The Berlin method is, 4 sets of 4. It's 4 reps, 4-second hold. I just tell people 3 sets of 5-second holds using a challenging weight. So I'll use a knee extension machine. I'll go to roughly 60 degrees of knee flexion or bend with my trunk kind of reclined, and I would be working at a weight that I could hold for 5 seconds, maybe 10, but not much more, right? And that's enough to really get that patellar tendon to adapt. If you're talking about the Achilles, I love a Smith machine, and so long as someone's not dealing with an insertional Achilles tendinopathy, I would put that person anywhere between, say, 20 degrees of dorsiflexion, to maybe 0 or plantar grade. But, you're trying to strengthen from a lengthened position. That's going to create a greater stimulus. And we have a lot of compelling research to show that's the case. But I think isometrics, people throw out a lot of numbers, but most of the time I'm working between 5 to 15 second holds with a challenging weight.
And Christina asks, is rest always a good idea for niggles? How to tell?
Is rest? No. When I talk to athletes, if they tell me like, look, I've pulled back and I've been resting and things aren't improving, that's telling me like, let's load the tissue with the issue and see how it responds. Now, you have to be careful. If someone has a bone stress injury, rest should improve it, right? When you remove the offending activity, which often cases running, things should definitely improve. But if you're not suspicious of a bone stress injury, I deal with a lot of athletes who have incompletely rehabbed muscle strains, for example, like a calf muscle strain, or they're dealing with a lower limb tendinopathy. Load is often people, when you expose them to load or you load the tissue with the issue, they'll often remark and say, is it weird that this actually feels better as I'm loading it? That's telling you that's exactly what that tissue needs.
And the final listener question is from Jack, who asks, are there specific preventative measures that people working an 8 to 5 desk job should take?
Yeah, I would say frequent movement throughout the day. So I use the term movement snacks. So what are movement stacks? Well, you could do something as simple as like a flow rope. I don't know if you guys have had Lawrence Van Lingen on. He's always talking about the flow rope and the underhand swings. I think that you can do, any kind of marching drill, hip airplanes. You could do penguin walks where you're sort of walking on your tiptoes. You can do wall sits, just little things that, aren't going to be fatiguing that you can do in, say, anywhere from 60 to 90 second passes or rounds. So when you do go to train, that, you're going to feel a little bit better. I think just sitting throughout the day and not taking breaks, you tend to train flat, or at least that's the case for me and a lot of the athletes I work with. So and people really respond well. And I think when you present it as a movement snack, it makes good sense. I would say incorporate some movement snacks, and I have a bunch through my Instagram channel that, hopefully will get your gears grinding or get you thinking about options.
Yeah. Now, the final question that I want to ask is if you can list 5 myths or misconceptions about what we talked about today, so injuries, strength training, mainly, anything else related that you can think of?
So I'm presenting at the physical therapy conference here next week on knee osteoarthritis and running. And, one of the points that I'm going to make is unless you've had past surgical medical history or other factors, running is very healthy for your knees when it's dosed sensibly. Running is chondroprotective. I don't see a lot of runners who come in with knee osteoarthritis. Same goes with low back pain. If they do have low back pain, maybe it's a poor bike fit, or maybe it's a sacral bone stress injury. And I don't say that to freak people out, but yeah, and I think that strength training, especially for most of the triathletes, I'll stick with that theme since it's that triathlon show. I think that it is really important, and people are looking to improve their performance. Well, if we can just get you a little bit stronger, I think that goes a long way, right? Other myths. I think that warm-ups are a contentious topic, in terms of injury prevention. Unless someone's doing a transition run or running off the bike, even with a lot of the elite level runners I work with, when you go out to run, just go walk for 5 to 10 minutes. You don't need to go crazy with all of this activation stuff. I'll run today, maybe, depending on whether or not I get out for a mountain bike. If I don't, I'll run tomorrow. But I just walk for 5 to 10 minutes, and I may do some side shuffles. I may do, a 10 to 15 second skipping pass. And then I just sort of, gradually bleed into my run. And then I do a 5-minute walking cool down. I think that's helpful to just transition away from your daily routine and get your mind focused on, your body, give it a little bit of prep, get some blood flow going. But I see people doing all of these ancillary activation drills and everything. And I'm like, just go for a walk, save yourself the time. And, I think you'll start to ritualize that aspect of your training, especially like avoiding the walk and sit or the run and sit. People finish a run and then they just go right back to their desk. Finish your run, have some water, get some food in your system, whether that's a snack or to sit down and have a meal. Yeah, those are the big ones.
All right. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that I can think of that I want your take on there in terms of myths.
I'll say one more thing, just because I got into trouble myself. If you're traveling and you're switching time zones, don't force a workout session that day. I think it's fine to get out for a walk. Maybe if, you're not, if it was like a 2 or 3 hour flight, maybe you can get out for a 30-minute run. But, I remember I went over to Hawaii with my family the one time, and I just purchased a new set of wheels for my bike. And I was so eager because I was busy, leading up to the trip. We got to Hawaii, I built my bike up, and right off the bat, I went out for a run, and I ended up in the middle of the road with a clavicle fracture and almost got killed by a car. So, if you ever catch yourself rushing or forcing a workout, really pause and just say, is the juice worth the squeeze on this? And just to remember, we train so much. Anyone who's listening to this, especially if you're doing triathlon, a missed session here or there is probably a blessing in disguise. And to really appreciate and put trust in the collective body of work. And to remember, this shit is fun, right? If you catch yourself getting too serious, check yourself, right? This is about fun. It's about pushing yourself. It's about going and racing with other people who are enjoying the sport. And, not to hesitate to let off the gas. I think it was Peter Reed who at one point said, if you're not losing fitness at some point during the year, you're probably doing it wrong, right? So don't be afraid to let off the gas.
Great advice. And speaking of fun, this conversation has been a lot of fun. So thank you for that, Chris. Really enjoyed it, and also extremely educational. Lots of nuggets here of wisdom. Thank you so much. Finally, where can people find you and find your work?
Yeah, so my main hub is chrisjohnsonpt.com. I would say as far as other ways to get connected with me, I'm pretty active on Instagram. I try to share a lot of this stuff. I feel like I'm at a point in my career where I'm still on the journey, still learning for sure, but I'm also putting a lot of stuff out that I found to be helpful that I apply in my own training as well as in working with athletes. and I always spend a lot of time in my newsletter, which I write a couple times a month. And I feel like I'm becoming a mystic in my old age. And I also have some half marathon programs that I just released that sort of incorporate a lot of the topics and concepts that we've been discussing. And then for clinicians that are out there, I have my master course, which is just called Clinical Running Essentials, which all of this stuff can be found on my website. So, and I run a podcast with my buddy Nathan, the Runner Zone. We get into some similar stuff that we were talking about here. So, but thank you so much for, again, having me on. You guys have had some great guests, and it's always flattering to be included in these conversations.
Well, you're definitely continuing that trend, so thank you. And we'll put all the links to the things you mentioned in the show notes. So have a great Friday. Hope you get your ride in or a good run, whichever works best. And hope to speak to you again another time.
Thank you so much, Michael.